in these places. And in that period, he knew everybody in the art world. In Italy, he worked alongside a lot of the big names at the time and would have seen artwork by anybody who was anybody. One of the really interesting things about him was that at some point, he was appointed by the Pope as a Knight of the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes and of Malta. A lot of geography in there because they kept getting kicked out of places by the Ottoman Turks. And in the 17th century, it's easy to think that those kind of conflicts were way back in the past. But in the 17th century, the great existential threat to Western Europe was the Ottoman Empire. Towards the end of his life, Vienna was under siege by an Ottoman army and was only saved at the last minute because a Polish army turned up to relieve the city. So there's a great sort of thread running right through the 16th and 17th century when the Ottomans are the enemy. And in Malta, the Knights had withstood a siege in the 16th century and still felt very much on the front line of Christendom. He was a Knight of Grace initially. I believe he was progressed to the rank of Knight of Justice. But the important thing about this is that the Knights were, believe it or not, although they went around bashing people and worse, they were a religious order. And the central group took vows like monks would take. It's just that they didn't stay inside the monastery. They got on ships and went all around the Mediterranean looking for Ottoman Turks to bash. Knights of Grace or of Justice were not part of that inner group. They were a kind of outer, almost like a community of oblates who supported. So he's a member of a religious order, but he's not taking vows of chastity and all the rest of it. So he's kind of in and yet not in. And it's a military order. So I've mentioned already this fresco painting and so on, and his style is broadly labelled Baroque. I hate these labels because he didn't know he was a Baroque artist. He didn't say, oh, I can't do that. That's not Baroque enough for me. These are labels that people afterwards have invented to make life simpler, and life is never simple. But I'll try and explain a little bit about what's going on in the period that's characteristic. So if we had the next slide, please. This is a picture of Mattia Preti by Mattia Preti, a self-portrait, and you can see that he's, as well, alongside his paintbrush, he's got his sword, because he's a knight, and he was really proud of that. And he's also wearing his red tabard over his sort of artist smock. He's got his red tabard. I bet he didn't really wear that all day long, but he wants everybody to know that he's a knight. He's part of the Hospitaller Order. Next slide, please. So what's the Baroque about? Well, first of all, it's really focused on people. It's interested in real people presented naturally, not in a stylized way. Real people who look like we do, look like other people in the street. So not idealized people. Even the saints are not idealized. They have to look grubby and scruffy and ordinary. And this focus on people and natural, real people carries through into a sense of drama. There's always something going on in these pictures. They're not sort of static saints. It's almost like a frame out of a film, a particularly dramatic Hollywood film usually. There's something going on, it's very cinematic, there's movement, there's emotion, there's drama, there's special effects with the lighting, and also innovation. They were really interested in presenting familiar subjects, the crucifixion, the Annunciation, whatever it might be. Familiar biblical subjects were explored not on the traditional models. They sat down, looked at the text, thought about it, prayed about it, talked to people about it, and tried to re-envision it as if it were real. They wanted to show it as it might really have been, certainly in terms of the emotional truth of it. They tend to go, because they're interested in people and their emotions and their reactions and actions, it's always very zoomed in. You don't tend to get long shot. You don't get broad panoramas. The background and the place is often almost entirely lost. It's just lots of people doing things crowded all over the surface of the picture. And they're always very serious. They're trying, it's like visual preaching. They're trying to challenge the viewer, draw the viewer in, get the viewer to feel as if they're part of what's going on. And in doing that, they have a lot of links with an extended medieval tradition, both Franciscan and then later in the 16th century, Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And in those traditions, people were invited to kind of meditate on the Bible, think about it, but do so visually. They would invite you to picture in your head the scene that you were reading. So when Jesus heals somebody, what is Jesus' body posture? How is he standing? Has he, if he's talking to children, do you picture Jesus standing up, going like this, looking all sort of remote and stern? Or do you imagine him saying, "Hi," and getting down there? None of the Gospels will give you Jesus' posture, except very, very rarely. But he adopted a posture. He had a look on his face. So what would that have been? And as you start to ask yourself, supposing I could draw or paint, or I was a film director, how would I set this up? And the Baroque artists are doing that in spades. Next slide, please. This is just another example. It's another Mattia Preti. There is the very faintest of halos. You just see there, and possibly just over here. Otherwise, you would never guess that was a religious picture. But it's the Visitation. The younger woman on the right is Mary, and the older woman is Elizabeth. And it's that scene from early in Luke's Gospel. And you see the dramatic lighting, very realistic, ordinary, everyday people. They're wearing the clothes that people wore in Italy in the mid-17th century. There's no attempt to recreate historic dress. This is set now. Because it doesn't look like that to us, but it did at the time. So imagine jeans and t-shirts and hoodies and this sort of thing. If we painted religious pictures like that now, people would be shocked. They go, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about that. Where's the tea towels on the heads and all that sort of stuff?" It's not right. But these pictures were meant to pull you up short and draw you in and make you realize that these people were just people. They were real people. Next slide, please. So the actual picture that we're focusing on this evening was painted in Malta in 1663. It probably wasn't a commission. A lot of artists way back would work to commission. Someone would pop round and say, "We want a picture for our church. It's got to be about that, by that, and this is the subject," and the artist would then make a note of everything, produce the picture, and it would go. So it was, in the modern jargon, site-specific. But this probably wasn't, because it's not a devotional picture, because very few Christians want to pray to Pontius Pilate, to be honest. So this isn't meant for a church. It might have the size and shape of an altarpiece, because it's very big. It's 2 meters by 1.8 meters. So that's, I'm not 1.8 meters high, so it's about, if it was stood on the ground, it's taller than I am and broader. So it's a big picture, and Pontius Pilate is therefore life-size and then some, more than life-size. So it wouldn't fit in a little house. It's obviously intended to go somewhere big, but probably in a private collection. It might have been intended for a wealthy person to hang in their home, perhaps in a study or something like that. There is another possibility, which is that it was intended for a church, but not as a focus of worship, but as something to make the clergy think pretty hard before they went into the church. And I'll explain a bit more about that possibility as we go on. But there was a bit of a thing about pictures to hang in vestries or sacristies that the clergy would see as they were putting their stuff on before they went in to lead worship. It's now, I'm afraid, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they've got so much stuff that it isn't even always on public display. So I wouldn't book your ticket to New York to go see it without giving them a ring to see whether you'd get to see it. And there's a lot of debate about whether it was left unfinished or whether it's been damaged over time, and I'll point that out as we go through. So next slide, please. So when you look at the picture, you see we've got Pontius Pilate here, as I say, larger than life, but rather kind of hunched up. We've got like a circle of figures around him, and then quite distinct, we've got a sort of background over on this side. So we'll start to work through now a bit and look at the picture itself in some detail. The next slide, please. And the next one. And the next one. Right, so the subject itself of Pontius Pilate washing his hands is quite rare. Normally, in sort of medieval art and later, if you see the image of Pilate washing his hands, it's as part of a whole series of pictures going through the Passion narrative. So perhaps starting with the Last Supper and the arrest of Jesus, and almost every little scene and moment has its own little picture, sometimes on the back of an altarpiece. And you do get images of Pilate like that, but you never get it as the subject of a work of art in its own right, really, till you get to the 16th century. And then in the 16th and 17th century, there's really quite a lot of them. So it's always worth asking, why this subject, why now? What's going on in the world that's making people think in this way? I've mentioned already the contemporary dress, which makes the story speak to us, or at least the people who would have seen it at the time. But another thing that helps understand this picture is the whole idea of theatre. We may not go to the theatre, or perhaps you really love the theatre, but it's just kind of there. But in the late 16th and early 17th century, theatre is massive. It's the latest thing. You get the first ever purpose-built theatres, at least since the ancient world, were built in Italy in the 16th century, because the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, Shakespeare and the Globe. People are into theatre, and the metaphors and imagery of theatre becomes everything. So theatre, I mean, even Calvin talks about the world as the glorious theatre of God's works, and you don't get the impression he went to the theatre very often, really, Calvin. But so it's an idea, and that Shakespeare thing, all the world's a stage, and the idea that we're all kind of playing a role in the world, but is that the real us? And what's real and what's acting is very, very much a sort of thread that runs right through the late 16th and 17th centuries. And in particular, you get political theatre. Don't think that managing your image is a modern 20th or 21st century thing. The rulers and powerful people in this, well, even back in the 15th century onwards, are deliberately dressing and presenting themselves publicly in a rather theatrical way and a very controlled sort of way to project an image of who they are and what they are. And I'll give you an example of that from France, which is pretty much contemporary with our picture in a moment. But if you think the court of Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles, it's just a big theatre in which ritual sort of things were done. Everything was a ceremony. Everybody dressed up. Everybody wore a mask. Everybody was projecting an image of themselves. And that's what Preti is playing with in this picture. Because one of the crucial things, I think, for Mattia Preti about that quote from the verse from Matthew is, when Pilate saw that he could do nothing. We've got the big alpha male, or would-be, who cannot do a thing. Can we have the next slide, please? That, believe it or not, is Louis XIV of France. This is within a few years, just slightly earlier than the Mattia Preti we're looking at. Oh, you could go to town working through all the imagery and iconography, but essentially here you've got a teenage king who's just come through a bit of a crisis, and he and the people around him are desperate to project him as, yeah, I might be a kid, but I'm a powerful kid. I am here presenting myself with all the imagery that goes with Jupiter, with the father of the gods from the classical world. And everything is rich and expensive and absolutely dripping with references to classical mythology. So it's a self-presentation is hugely important. This is not a shy, retiring age. If you've got it, you flaunt it with tassels. Next picture, please. So when we go back to this, you start to see what's going on. Pontius Pilate is presenting himself in all his best gear. He's got a rich, heavy fur outer jacket, but underneath you can sort of see with his knee breeches and his silk slippers, this is flash, expensive designer clothes. He's got his fur hat on with his insignia. He's the big man. He's raised up on a platform. He's sitting on a lavish throne. He's got that same as with Louis XIV. He's got his elaborate drapery, expensive stuff hanging up around him. He's the big man, and this is a very 17th century self-advertisement as the power in the land. And he's surrounded by his staff. There's a man in armour, he's got his slaves and his page boys and so on. And then you notice, right down here, you've got Jesus. So Preti is playing with the idea of power. Who is the real power? Who is the important person? Next slide, please. So when we go into the detail now, we're going to look at, first of all, go down to the corner to look at Jesus and the guard with him. Then we'll go up to the top left and look at the background. Then we'll look at the circle of figures around Pilate. And then finally, we'll go to Pilate himself and zoom in on him and what he's doing. And in particular, the fact that I'm sure you noticed is that he's looking at you, because you're looking at him, which is a very Baroque thing. So theatre, but we're breaking the fourth wall constantly in Baroque painting. So in the theatre, you probably know you've got this sort of box, but there's a wall missing, and then there we all are. And it's the same here. You know, imagine this is the stage, but anybody on this side of it, if it's a theatre, pretends that you're not there. But if they start talking directly to you, it's called breaking the fourth wall. It's somehow collapsing the idea that you're suspending reality, that you're watching people who are really who they say they are, instead of people lying through their teeth, effectively, because they say they love one another and they don't, actually. They hate each other, but they're just good at pretending. So you've got that thing about pretense and reality, and Pilate, by looking at you, as you look at him, is actually throwing that all open. Who's for real here? Why are you looking at me? Why are you judging me? The next slide, please. So we zoom down to Jesus in the bottom corner, and we notice he's got the crown of thorns on his head, and he's wearing the scarlet robe. We've got a bit of a problem here. That's wrong, because Pilate's washing his hands. And if you read Matthew's Gospel, when Pilate has finished washing his hands, Jesus is taken inside by the soldiers to prepare him for execution, when they put the scarlet robe and the crown of thorns on the head, mock him, and then, says Matthew, they put him back in his own clothes before they take him out. But he's out in the scarlet, so he can't be. So that's wrong. So did Preti just not read the Gospel very well? No, it's deliberate. He knows that those two images can't be together. But it's really important to him that you see Jesus here in the scarlet robe and with the crown of thorns, because he's been mocked for being the king that he isn't, but of course he really is. So he's been dressed up in a theatrical costume to mock him, but he's the real king, he's the real power, the real authority. Pilate is wearing his own clothes, but he's the fake. He has no power. So Preti is deliberately blurring the gospel fact, if you like, to bring out the deeper truth. We also notice down here that this area of the picture doesn't quite look as finished as the rest of it. And right up that left-hand side of the picture, as we look at it, looks a bit like that. It could have had the surface abraded accidentally. These things happen. When I was a vicar in Bradford in the 1990s, we had some very old 17th century oil paintings that were very, very dirty. And we were trying to get some money together to have them restored. And I came in one day and found the church warden and his wife with the picture down on the floor with a mop and a bucket of flash to try and get some of the muck off, vicar. When you do that, it's not a recommended restoration technique in case you're tempted to try. And if that sort of thing happens, you can lose all the sort of surface layers of paint. Or the artist never put them on in the first place, or he didn't want them to be there. He actually wanted that part of the picture to look unfinished and out of focus, as to make that contrast I've been talking about stronger. Next slide, please. So if we zoom in, we also see the look, you get a sense of what Jesus is going through, just through the body posture. So although the actual, if you like, the drawing in the painting of Jesus' face is not hugely detailed, nor the soldier behind him, it doesn't really need to be, because it's actually in the dynamics, the way Jesus is moving. You can see the rope tied round his neck, and that little touch with the soldier's hand on his shoulder as the soldier is sort of looking at him. And one of the questions there is that a rough gesture and he's about to shove him, or is it actually almost, come on mate, there's a sense of connection and empathy. And then behind them you can just see the kind of mass of faces, And then as you go further back, you start to get the kind of vague background scenery. The next slide, please. So we've been looking over here, and the next place we're going to go is just up a little bit higher. But we're just reminded here that we've got this sort of diagonal compositional line where we're drawn initially because of the highlight and the brightness. That just draws the eye. So when you first glance at that picture, you tend to look here, then very quickly you look here, and then you're drawn across to the highlight areas, and then you go down here, and you suddenly spot that that's Jesus. But he's sort of little and receding from us, and the bloke that you're having to look at is Pilate. Next slide, please. So as we zoom in, there's a few things you start to notice in the background. First of all, you start to notice the architecture. And this is a good moment to, if you can see the lines here, that looks like what they call a pentimento, in other words, a second thought. In other words, initially, Preti intended that building, the cornice of the building, to run right down beyond Pilate's head. And then either he never got round to finishing it, or he changed his mind and decided to stop that building at that point rather than carrying it on beyond the head. But what I really want to focus on over here is the weaponry, the smoke, the time of day, and this little scene in the background on top of the arches. If we go to the next slide, please. We zoom in, and we'll start with the easy bit. Here we've got a bit of military kit from the 17th century. It's a pole weapon. Halberd is a nice, easy word, but it's strictly speaking, I don't think it is a halberd. If anybody's really into their weaponry and military history, it might be a fouchard. But anyway, by the 17th century, these still would kill you, but they're ceremonial mainly. So we've got a bit of ceremonial weaponry sticking up, and presumably it's carried by one of the other soldiers who's escorting Jesus to be crucified. But why is it there? I mean, what drew the artist to stick that thing sticking up in the background? Well, I think what's going on here is that if you look at medieval paintings of saints, saints often had, because identifying, if you've got loads of saints all over the walls and windows, who are they all? It's a bit tedious to write it all up, and not everybody could read. So saints are given little attributes that tie into something of their story. So if you see Catherine, how do you know it's Catherine? Because she's leaning on or holding some sort of wheel. So if you see a female figure, halo, wheel, it's St. Catherine. Matthew, the gospel writer, often has an axe with him because, sadly, he's supposed to have been martyred by having his head cut off. What you get often in the 17th century is a very subtle reworking of those traditional medieval attributes. So instead of St. Bartholomew, who was supposed to have been flayed alive, holding a knife, you get a picture of him and he'll be peeling an apple with a knife, or he'll just have like a penknife on the table next to him. So they turn it into something that might have been there anyway. So that halberd or whatever says Matthew, and because it's Matthew's gospel, that's the only one of the gospels that has the hand washing by Pilate. So that's just a little visual cue, I think. That's saying Matthew's gospel, folks. If you want to read the text that goes with this, look at Matthew. In the background, we'll start up here. You see there's like a chimney with some smoke going up. What's that doing there? I mean, artists don't waste their time painting stuff for no reason. So every detail in this picture is there for a reason. So what is that for? Is it about prayer rising like incense to heaven? It could be. Is it a reference to the Exodus story, the pillar of fire, the pillar of smoke or cloud? Is that what it's a reference to? So it's kind of visually saying, and all this is to do with the greater Exodus, the liberation, the resurrection. This is part of the story of our redemption. It could be. And then we've got this series of arches, and we've got a figure who looks to me like it's probably a female figure, and she's probably putting the washing out or hanging the bedding and the night clothes. You've got that looks like a shirt with two sleeves dangling, and this looks like sheets off the bed. And I have a feeling that that's just saying mourning, because we know that in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is taken to Pilate at the crack of dawn, first thing in the morning. So we're trying to say mourning. So he's thinking, what goes on? How can I say mourning? Well, I can do sky stuff. I can make it look like sunrise in the background, but then sunrise and sunset look a bit similar. So how do I tell people it's morning? Oh, I know. I'll put a little figure in who's just got all the, you've got your nightgown and your sheets off the bed, and in nice hot dry places you can just take them out instead of opening a window or something or folding back the bedding. You just pull it off the bed and go throw it outside so that the sun and the breeze will freshen it up, and then you put it back on the bed at night. And then you don't have to use your washing machine quite so often. So I think that's what's going on. It's a little domestic touch that's about ordinary life, but also it's like having a clock with, 7 a.m. on or something in the background. Next slide, please. So that's what we've been looking at over here. And these pictures almost always have these little details that not everybody would have noticed. But if that was on the wall of your study or library or sacristy and you saw it every day, you would keep seeing these things. And people liked the idea that they knew what it meant. So everybody, these are intended to be read and lived with and meditated on and prayed about, reflecting on for quite a long, extended period of time, and they're full of little touches for you to find. Next slide, please. So we now start to work around the group that are gathered around Pilate. And first of all, we've got this big, again, emphasizing the diagonal. We've got this elderly man, and you can see that, he's not idealized. He looks like he's seen a bit of life, and he's dressed up in his military uniform, 17th century, not 1st century. He's got his armor on, he's got his rich red robes on, but he's staring up at Pilate. All his attention is focused on him. Next slide, please. Of course, there's quite a bit of artistic showing off, because painting light reflecting off steel is really difficult. So there's a bit of virtuosity. Yes, I've got lots of armor and I've got a nice metal jug because I can do that. I'm good. It's really hard to do. And again, with the sort of brass or golden bowl that's used for the washing of the hands, there's all those little details. So we've got the older man down here, and then we've got the page boy. If you can peer into the murk, he is wearing sort of 17th century page boy costumes. And I know he looks a bit girly, but they all tended to then. It was fashion. So that kind of back-combed look has not been male fashion for some centuries. Not in Yorkshire anyway, where I come from. But he's a page boy, and then we've got the little slave. Now, I don't know how people in the 17th century react to that, but I know how we do, and we don't like it. But what it's reminding us today, and something that Pretty wouldn't have thought about, is all these eminent, powerful people, certainly in southern Europe in the 17th century, had slaves. Slavery was not something that only happened in the 18th and 19th century in the Caribbean. It was a reality in 15th, 16th, 17th century Europe. And so that just needs to make us stop and think. But you notice they're all looking in. And there's also something going on here too, because we've got an old guy who looks a little bit past it for military service, you might say, and we've got young, and then we've got middle-aged. In other words, we have the three ages of man. And what we've got then is, because we've got figures of different age grouped around, that stands for the whole of humanity. That's the whole of humanity looking in. That's past, present, and future as well. So that this moment is a moment in history, but the artist is saying, and he's doing it also by drawing us in, this is a moment now. This is a moment you have to take seriously now. We have to think about this and engage with this, because what's going on here is of significance throughout the whole of human history. Next slide, please. Then we notice the washing with water. We notice all the detail that's gone into those hands to make them look really lifelike, as if it really is just a still from a film, where you can see all the movement and the energy, the water moving in the bowl. And we ask ourselves questions about the symbolism here, the idea of washing and what that's about, all the significance of water, the baptism imagery, washing away our sins, and the sense in which also, and this is why it might be an image for a clergy vestry, he's all dolled up in his finery, but he's nobody, and he's trying to wash his hands clean to make himself innocent. Well, in a Catholic Mass, the clergy were, in this period, dolled up in a lot of finery, and as part of their preparation, they would have washed their hands, and they would also have done that in the liturgy, saying a line from one of the Psalms, you know, I will wash my hands in innocency that I may go about your altar. And here is Pilate trying to wash the guilt away. And so if that were intended to hang in a sacristy or vestry, that's a direct challenge to the clergy, because they're watching somebody doing what they're about to do, and they're being asked, are you any better than this guy? Can you really wash away your sin? How does that happen? Next slide, please. And then we zoom in on Pilate, and we see that all eyes really are on him, on what he's just said, on what he's just done, on what we know is happening to Jesus. And we see that he's looking at us. He does not look like a happy man. He's not feeling good about this. He's not actually in a power position. If you look at the posture that he's in, he's hunched over. And actually, I think there's something symbolic. If we go on to the next slide, please. The architecture is, there is a huge stone lintel right over his head. Why? It's a visual way of talking about the weight that's bearing down on him. He isn't actually supporting that structure, but this is a man who is oppressed by the situation he's in, the responsibility he has, the weight of expectation from his superior officers. He's trying to avoid a riot and trouble, because if there's trouble, he'll have to send the troops out on the streets. And if he sends the troops out on the streets, that might make things worse rather than restore order. And if it goes pear-shaped, and he's going to send to Syria for reinforcements. That weakens the frontier. And maybe this is a conspiracy, and the Persians over the frontier are actually putting people up to create an insurrection in Jerusalem to divert Roman troops off the frontier so that they can break through. And all that is going through his head. I can't let this happen. This man is innocent, but he's got to die, otherwise I lose my job. And then we've caught him, looking weak and furtive and difficult, and then he makes eye contact and says what? What is his challenge? You do the same. Don't tell me you wouldn't. Don't think you're any better than I am. And are we? That's what the look in that face is all about his own sense of being empty and broken and having just done something wrong, but then reacting to the judgment that's coming at him from the people around him. Next slide, please. So that text is then being explored through that visual image. And at that point, I think we'll have a break. And then if there are things you'd like to ask or things you'd like to share, I will be back here and ready to listen and to answer if I can. Thank you.